Oh yes, she was. I have to. It was actually my late grandfather Avasholem, who I named after. It was his yahrzeit yesterday, and I only found out yesterday morning. So can we dedicate this to Kopel Ben David Mordechai? It's actually my name, I'm named after him. So it's my dad's father. And any other dedications?
No, that's I wish you long life, and I wish your father long life, and maybe Aliyah for your grandfather's mission.
So the one thing, just one thing before I start is just one thing. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello? Okay, so in Pirkei Avot, one of the, I don't know all the words, but one of the things in Pirkei Avot, I'm going to do this after, just to say this for like 30 seconds, is the three crowns, Torah, the crown of a good name, and the other one is, I don't know what the other one is, but the crown of a good name supersedes them all, and that's my late grandfather, Avasholem, who I'm named after, had a very good name, and was a very straight, honest guy. That's it. So that's anyway. So let's continue here. This week's.
Well, I think you're continuing the legacy of his name, because you exactly
trying. I don't know if I'm in that league, but
you sound
have to just try our best.
Very much in the same league. Yeah?
So this week's parsha coming up is Parshat Tetzaveh, and it talks about the different begadim of the Kohen Gadol in the Avodah in the temple, the service in the temple, and one of the accessories there was a robe, there was a tunic, there was the ephod. The ephod was the thing that went like around his back like a waist, but it had the 12 stones representing the 12 tribes, and it says here it was upon his heart. So that's where it worked out. Once he put it on, it was it appeared over his heart, and it says what it says here in the commentaries in the article. Those who bear responsibility of Jewish leadership must always pray for those who depend on him, for they cannot succeed without Hashem's help. You can't do it on your own, and I think that also ties into someone might be very capable and very competent, not like certain people in this world or certain governments. Anyway, we won't go down that road. So they still Hashem is the one that blesses them with those talents. So they need to pray and to know where they were where those mitzvot come from, where those blessings come from in life. That was my 2 cents worth to add to that.
Sure. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you. So,
you can put me on mute, Damon, because there's sometimes good traffic here.
Okay.
I'm just going to walk around. Of course.
Okay, so the Gemara portion, we're on the 1997 daf, and Rava inquired of Rav Chisda if one lends his fellow and fixes payment on a coin, and the authority is added to it, what is the law? So what do we mean fixes payment on the coin? It's that basically we said that he lends his fellow money where there's a repayment of coinage, and a certain stipulation in terms of how it's going to be paid back. And there are 2 different examples given. That's if you only loan money, and the other one is if you loan money in return for making sure this individual can buy produce with that money. So you've got that added complication. And what does it mean in the authorities added to it? What is the law? What it's basically saying is that the government issued new Selaim that have a larger silver component than the old Selaim. And the old Selaim no longer passes currency in the province. Okay? So Rav Chisda responds to the inquiry to Rava, and he says, look, the borrower gives the lender the coin that passes as currency at the time of the repayment of the loan. In other words, even in our case, he repays using the new currency. Okay, that's according to that opinion of Rav, if you remember. And Rav says to Rav Chisda, and does this rule even apply when the new coin is as large as a sieve? What does he mean as large as a sieve? It's that he's asking basically if there's any adjustment that's made, even if the silver content of the new seller was increased so dramatically that it's as wide as a sieve in comparison to the old. So we are saying there are two things that make up a coin's value: perception and the actual amount of silver that's used. So if from a perception point of view, the currency is worth the same, but it's got more silver, does that affect the equation that you end up paying less coinage because the silver content is higher and the coin itself is of a wider diameter thickness? So Rav Chisda said to Rava, yes, it applies whether or not the coin is big or small, meaning that you have to pay in the latest currency possible. And he's saying even when the coin is as large as a tortilla. So first time I read it, I was kind of moggy on Shabbos, and I read the word, what do you mean tortilla? I thought it's a tortilla the size of a pita. So therefore, you've got to learn to your Chazorah, guys, because I came up and I thought, what do you mean the size of a tortilla? So anyway, I thought I'd just share with you how moggy I was when I actually learned it at first. So I'd say no. A tortilla is a dry measure, and I had to look it up. It basically is the volume of 6 eggs, and it contains a quarter of a cup. So it's saying that if it's gone a ridiculous size in terms of the width, is it seen as you still pay with the new currency, even though the silver content is dramatically increased? It still if it's the same representation of the money. And Rav Chisda said to Rav, yes, look, as long as it's the same amount of money value, it doesn't matter if there's new silver, because that's what the government decided to issue. And at the end of the day, the lender can't be out of pocket because the borough gives it to him at some old exchange. So the Gemara asks one final question. It says, but what happens if the produce is cheaper? So it's saying that hang on a second, it is going to make a factor difference, because if the silver content of the new Silaim is greater than the silver content of the old Silaim, the new Silaim will buy more produce than the old Silaim. So if the borrower pays the lender 10 new Silaim for 10 old Silaim of the original loan, the lender is obviously certainly going to receive from the borrower more than he lent him. And what's the issue with that if both parties agree? Because it's violating the biblical prohibition of ribis, taking interest on a loan, according to Rashi. So we might have to factor in the fact that it's made of different material, even if the buying power is the same. The Gemara says, look, there's more to it than that. If you look at what Rav Ashi said, he actually says we look at the situation. So if the produce is cheap on account of the greater silver content of the new king currency, or the new provincial currency, or monarchy, or government, or whatever the case may be, whatever that new currency is, if the silver content has made the produce cheaper because you can buy more produce on the same amount of coinage, we reduce the payment for him. In other words, we don't make the borrower pay 10 new Silaim in place of the old Silaim of the original loan. Rather, we can adjust the payment. What does that mean? The borrower, guys, repays fewer of the coins so that the total silver content in the new Silaim will still buy the same amount of produce. So that's where the effective difference is compared to just loaning money. Because if there was just money lent and there wasn't produce being bought on the silver content of it, then it's a clear case of you just paying in currency. But the minute produce is thrown into the account, that's taken into conclusion. Furthermore, there's another factor that goes into account. And this is according to Rav Ashi, is that if the produce is cheap on account of the market price, we don't reduce the payment for it. So what do we mean? Okay, so you'll have different years, and sometimes you might have abundant rainfall, and it's a bountiful crop. And then what that means is that there's an oversupply of produce and it drives the prices down. Okay, it's not like it is now where it's put into storehouses. And I saw a terrific article that sometimes they throw produce away instead of giving it to the poor people. because the logistical cost of transportation is worth the cost of refrigeration and logistics, and further to which they want to keep the prices at a certain rate. One of the indicators where Alain de Botton mentioned this in the Renaissance period is when they imported pineapples from the Caribbean islands. That the pineapple in Europe was seen as such a prestigious fruit that it became a status symbol, and it was cheaper to buy cocaine in today's terms. So the minute that people started figuring out a way to grow pineapples and create almost a hotbox in the European climate, the value of the pineapple tanked because it was no longer seen as a prestigious fruit. It's the same thing that you might have certain years where there's oversupply of produce and then the market prices go down. And in that case, we don't reduce the lender's amount that the borrower has to pay for it. Why? Because of an obvious reason. I mean, initially it seems like this give and take of the Gemara seems strange. Because the Gemara says, look, originally it said that the buying power of the new and larger seller is greater, which assumes that in that case the market price of produce remains the same. Why? Because it's still, the coin is worth what it's worth. And then Rav Ashi said, look, it doesn't matter if the buying power increases because the silver content increases, irrespective of the currency, then there's a problem because that's going to contradict our assumption. So in that particular case, Taurus MX says that basically if the silver content increases the seller's buying power, then that creates a semblance, or at least guys a perception of ribos, only if the market price remains the same. But if all of a sudden there's a oversupply in the market and the price of produce fell, and that also might be a contributing factor to the increased buying power of the seller coin, and not just the value of the silver content, then it no longer creates a semblance of ribos. In other words, it's no longer a perception issue. Even though in truth the silver content was also a contributing factor, but it's not the only factor. So again, summary is that the old coin and the new coin is worth the same in the market value. Okay, so the borrower gets the same coinage back, and even though there's a higher silver content, then we're saying it depends how big the coin is, and the Christ is saying to Rav, it doesn't matter how big the coin is, if it's deemed the same value from an objective point of view, whatever the contents are, it's fine. Then I've actually said, look, what happens if the produce is cheaper? Meaning that if you melt down the silver, you can actually get more produce for the coins. Surely the borrower should get less coins. And the Gemara agrees, only if the produce has remained the same price, and it's the silver content of the coins that have caused the stronger buying power. But if there's an oversupply of produce, then that could also be a contributing factor, and it wouldn't be put down just to ribos, which is the interest charged or perceived to be charged by the borrower from the that the borrower was charged from the lender. You get what I'm saying? So that sort of factor will be taken into account. Maritime, how it's perceived. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward.
Can I ask you one simple question?
Sure.
I don't quite understand why, even though it's a bigger coin, it's the same value. So let's say I've got a 50 Rand today, it's a smaller silver coin, and I come up with a bigger one, but it's still worth 50. Why would the silver, unless you melt it down, but if you're using it as currency, it's the same tender value. So I'm battling to understand why that actually is an issue.
Okay, so you're in good hands because the Gemara is battling to understand it either. Also, and this is what it's going through. It says, look, at the end of the day, it's saying exactly like Gavin's saying, is that it's the same value. The only difference is the one is new currency and the other one was phased out. So what difference does it make? And the Gemara is saying, well, it might make a difference because if the perception is that the silver content is higher and therefore that's created more value, the borrower is actually paying interest to the lender. So in that particular case, it's going to create the perception of ribos, of charging interest. And even though that's not the case, because in reality, as Gavin said, the value of the currency is the same, the perception is a problem. And we learned about the perceptionary problem with slaves, kidnapping the slave for the day to get him to do work. And we're basically saying it's okay, because if it's deemed as a robbery, you only have to return the slave as is. But if that person owes you money, you can't do that, because it's as if you've charged an interest with one of his assets to make use of those assets. It's about perception, Gav. So perception is a problem.
But to me, it's only really becomes a problem when you melt it down. If you don't melt it down, but I understand there's a perception problem, but not to the same degree as maybe what they're saying. But I kind of get it. It's fine.
But you're 100% right, because you would hold with Rav Chisda, who said it doesn't matter how big the coin gets. If the market-related price of the currency is the same, it could be as large as a sieve or even as a tatia.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
Exactly, that's it.
He said to Rava, the currency is the currency's worth. It is what it is. And basically, the objection is Rav Ashi, who turns around and says, well, look, what happens if the produce is cheaper? Meaning that on account of the greater silver content of the new coin, maybe we can reduce the payment for him. Otherwise, it's actually got tangible value. If you melt it down, you're actually going to get better value. And if not even melted down, the perception that you're getting better value is that you're allowed to charge ribos. So the answer to that is that if the produce has gone down in price because there's an oversupply in the market, then somebody can't put it down to that perception of ribos, because there's a myriad of factors. But if the produce is holding its value, then they can misunderstand it, even whether he melted it down or not, that he charged interest, even though in its raw state it wouldn't. So that's Rav Ashi's opinion, but it's not all opinions. In fact, Rav Chisda would agree with you, Gavin, or you'd agree with Rav Chisda, let's put it that way. So the Gemara is now in a quandary, it doesn't know what to do. So the Gemara is asking what Gavin's going to ask now. He says, look, even if the produce is cheaper on account of market price, the new coin is still more valuable with respect to the ingots one can make out of it. So what are these ingots? Ingots, okay, granted there's no ribos violation from the standpoint of the increased buying power of the new coin. But the lender still benefits from the fact that he actually can receive more silver than he lent. And if he wants to go through the schlep of melting down the new coins into silver ingots, he will have more ingots than he would have had he melted down the old coins that he lent. So there's still a problem of actual ribos, apart from the perception, depending on if he wants to go to the trouble of melting down the coins. So do we say that the default position is people aren't going to melt down the coins and the currency holds it fixed? It's just new currency as opposed to discontinued currency? Or do we say, no, people are going to take the trouble of melting it down because they're earning more money? And then it's not even a perception of ribos, it is ribos. But the perception stands whether he melts it or not. So this is what we've got to deal with. So the answer it, if you look at the Gemara, is it says, look, the law is that which Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, ruled in practice, to adjust for the difference in the basis of Zuzim of Agadimus, the Arab, until a ratio of 10 to 8. So what does this mean? Is that, guys, there was an incident in which somebody lent a coin and the old coins were replaced by these larger new ones, right? So Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, went to Agadimus. He was an Arab merchant, famous merchant, very wealthy guy. And he had the old coins and the new coins because he was managing currencies, and what would happen is the old coins would be taken to be melted down, where you could have a coin embossed upon it. But what they did find is in that particular situation that 8 of the new coins contained the same amount of silver as 10 of the old coins. Okay, so the old coins needed 10 of that to get the same silver as 8 new coins, which means there was the new coins had more silver in it. So basically, Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Shua, ruled that even if the buying power of the larger new coin isn't greater, Gavin, than that of the smaller old coin, so that there's no problem of ribos in reality because there's no greater buying power. Since the silver content of the new coin was 25% greater than the old coin, payment had to be adjusted due to the risk of ribos because of the much greater silver content. Because you have people that are strange. People are coming from different economic backgrounds. So you have people that decide to pay somebody to clean the place, like a domestic worker, and other people that decide that it's not worth paying somebody and they'd rather do the work themselves. Now, what does it depend on? It doesn't depend on what a domestic worker earns. It depends on what your time is per hour. So you might have people that their time is not worth a high amount per hour, in which case they've marked down the coins and it's definitely ribos. So we've got to go in the worst default position in this case, according to Rav Papa, the son of Rav Huna. So therefore, it had to be adjusted to 8 coins, whereas the old one required 10 coins to get the same amount of silver.
Can I just ask you a question again? Sorry, Damon, one question, sorry.
Sure.
What I don't understand is now, okay, so you're the lender, right? So I lend you 10 100 Rand notes, right? And they're in a certain currency, right? And then you come back and now, because the weight of those 10 Rand, what did I say, 100 Rand, let's say they're 100 Rand coins. Let's say 10 100 Rand coins now are slightly heavier, right? So I'm only going to give you 8 back because of the weight, but then you're only going to get 800 Rand back from me. You're not going to get the thousands. You've actually lost in currency terms. It isn't so you're worried about ribos on the one side, but now you've got the lender who's actually losing 2 coins. If he's going to melt it down, he loses nothing. But if he doesn't melt down, he loses.
I think you've got a valid point, because what Gavin's saying, guys, is that who the heck wants to schlep and melt down coins? You actually, if I'm lending somebody money and I'm going to have to go to a whole schlep to get my money back, most people lend money to earn interest. If Jews aren't supposed to lend Jews money to earn interest, they're doing it as a huge favor. So why make them go through all this effort of melting silver ingots or going to schlep to have it melted down, when in fact, if they don't do that, they lose money. And you're inconveniencing a person that lent money to his fellow Jew by penalizing him and saying, well, you're going to have to either schlep and melt it down yourself or go to a smelting house to do it. So Gavin's asking a good question. And the answer to that, Gavin, is that there's this issue of this ratio of 10 to 8. Let me just explain it to you. Let me finish one sec, and it'll make sense. There is a limitation on that clause. Okay, so there's no problem with ribos because there's no greater buying power with a new coin, even though it's got more silver. So the payment only had to be adjusted if you're dealing with the content of 25% or more. That's when you get this 8 to 10 ratio. But if it's less than 25%, we know nobody's going to go through the effort of melting it down, because it costs 25% in order to melt it down. Do you get what I'm saying? In other words, the Rosh explains that if you look at the difference in the silver content and it's less than 25%, the lender doesn't benefit from the larger coin. Why? Because the cost of melting down the coins amounted to 25% of the coin's total silver content, because the way the Rosh explains it is that people don't melt down their own coins. You need special equipment. So the fee for the services rendered was 25%. So nobody's going to melt it down. In that particular case, if the difference between the old currency and the new currency is only a 25% increase in silver, nobody's going to bother melting it down, because that commission that's charged by a smelting house that gets it back to that hot liquid, that profitability walks away because of the percentage they charge in terms of the currency. You get what I'm saying? The only difference is with this case of this Arab guy, this Argodemus, into a ratio of 10 to 8. is if you have a look and you look at 8, you're adding on 25% to make it 10. So then in that particular case, you make an adjustment if it's 25% or more. If it's less than 25%, then you have an issue where we just assume that the person's not going to make rubis on melting it down because his cost factor is going to be withered away in terms of what he's going to pay to a service house to do the smelting because he doesn't have the equipment himself. So, Gavin, that would answer your question perfectly, according to the Rosh's answer.
Thank you.
See, now I have to be awake in the group, otherwise I'm going to be taken to pieces. That's what I love about you guys, is that you can never underestimate the group, ever.
And you can never overestimate us being awake either.
So, yeah, but do you get how the Rosh solves the problem?
No, 100%.
Yeah.
And these guys solve everything.
Yeah, they do. So
I don't always agree 100%, but I mean, it's they get it, put it this way, we couldn't get anywhere close. And I agree with them like most of the time, as you do.
Exactly. Now, Kevin, what time is your lesson?
At 6.
Okay, we've got 8 minutes. Let's just throw into it.
No, it's fine. No, it's fine.
So the Gemara discusses the law of damages with respect to coins. Rabba said, one who throws the coins of his fellow into the Great Sea, it's a term for the Mediterranean or any body of water, is not liable to pay for any damages. What's the reason? Well, he says to the owner of the coin, why? It lies before you. If you want to take it, take it. So what's this talking about, basically? It's saying, look, at the end of the day, the coin is right in front of you and you haven't lost it. Therefore, there's no damage. So basically, we're saying that it depends on certain conditions because it applies only if the coin was thrown into clear waters where the owner can see the coin and take it for himself. But if the coin was thrown into murky waters where he doesn't see it, the thrower is not free of liability because why? Because if you can't see the coin, it's considered lost, and the throwing of the coin into the sea constitutes an act of actual damage, not mere causative damage. So look, the bottom line is as follows, is that if somebody is on a precipice of a rock face, for example, and he knocks his friend's coins into the ocean, now, even though you could see it because it's like the Mediterranean is the super clear blue water, if the owner can't retrieve it on its own, you'll have to hire a professional diver or scuba diver or whatever the case may be to get it. But the thrower is not liable to pay for the coin nor for the cost of retrieval. So that was the unusual part. Why not the cost of the retrieval? Because here he didn't take it in his hands and throw it in the water. He struck his fellow's hands from below, and therefore what happens is that action propelled the coins into the water. Water is clear. It didn't go away from sight. It's not lost. It's not damaged. And although you have to pay a diver to retrieve it, that's an indirect damage. It's called grama, which is causative damage, because it's not as if he by his own hand threw the coins directly. So this term causative is a bit of an irritating term because it seems to mean that if you cause it, you don't have to pay. So direct damage is if I take the coins from your hand and I take it from Kevin's hand, for example, and I take it on the rock face. We're busy in the Kinneret and overlooking Tiberias. I take the coins from his hand or I take his car keys and I throw it in the water. In that particular case, I'm liable because I directly took the keys and threw it in. And in that case, even if it's retrievable, I'd still have to pay for having a professional diver to retrieve the keys. Okay? But if I simply knocked it out of Kevin's hand because I was skylarking, that's indirect because my hand never took it from his. In order to be liable for theft, you have to take it with your own hands from one to a location to another. But not if you do it with a shinoi, indirectly. You use a way that you wouldn't usually by grabbing your hands. So in other words, if you took it with your teeth, that might not be considered theft. It certainly wouldn't be direct. So grama is indirect or causative damage. So firstly, factor one is if you can see the coinage or car keys, there's no liability. If you can't see the coins or car keys, it's as if it's lost and there is liability, even if you knocked it out of somebody's hand. If you knocked it out of somebody's hand and it's clear, the water, then in that particular case, even if it was on purpose, you never took it with your own hand, so it's not an act of direct theft. So even if he has to pay a professional diver to retrieve it, there's no damages action that he can sue the person that did that for him. I would suggest if you have a friend like that, you get new friends. All it's saying is if he took the coin in his hand and threw it into the sea, it's considered halachically as if he stole it. Why? Because in the Torah in Leviticus chapter 5 verse 23, it obligates the robber to return the stolen article that he stole. In other words, he has to return it from what he actually took. So the last thing of it is he's required, if he used his own hands to return it, pay for the cost of returning it. So the Gemara challenges Rabba's premise that a coin in the Great Sea, which can be retrieved only by divers, is not considered lost. So we're gonna deal with this issue tomorrow. And guys, thank you for the share. We've got 2 minutes left.
Damon. Okay, thanks. How many minutes do you have left?
2.5 minutes. You want to share something with the group?
Okay. Yeah, I just want to ask. So somebody is saying someone that I've gone through this. If they knock the keys or the coins out of his hand by mistake and it falls into clear water or murky water, if it falls into clear water, it can be retrieved, but there's still a cost involved. You say, but divers might have to be hired or crane or something like that. So who's liable for the cost?
If it's by mistake, that's one thing. We're saying here if it's even less obvious, but it's on purpose. He thinks it's funny to take a friend is holding his car keys and pointing to his friend about something in the background. His friend knocks the keys out of his hand on purpose, but he doesn't directly take it from his hand, and it's knocked into clear water where there's a professional diver that can retrieve it. There's no damages where that person has to pay for the professional diver because he never directly took it out of his friend's hand. It was on purpose to took it off. But if it's in murky water, he has to pay for it because it's considered lost. In other words, there's no ways it can be retrieved. But the chiddush here is that he is liable if he took it out of his hand physically. So the Gemara says, well, what happens if it's clear water or dirty, but he took it out directly? Is there liability on it? That's what we're going to deal with as an issue. The shock to me is that if you did that to your friend, if you didn't take it directly out of his hand, why you should be off the hook for hiring a diver for retrieval costs. Just because it's indirect, it's grammar. So I don't understand. But then we never understood this was something Kevin. That you could tie somebody up.
It's a very tricky one.
Yeah. So in Shuman, they'll be liable.
If you at the clear water mall and you knock your friend's keys out of his hand into the fish pond, does it matter if the water is murky or not? It should be clear. If you thought
clear water mall, you can drop his keys anywhere in the shopping center and you say.
Yeah, exactly.
What happens if it's actually not clear water? How's that for a shiloh?
That's a shiloh.
It's supposed to be clear because it's called the clear water mall. Arthur, do you like that one?
He doesn't know the clear water mall. He doesn't know what you're talking about.
Where's the clear water mall?
That place was flat when